Hey everybody, back for lecture number 3 on the brain. When we met last time, we were talking about the diencephalon. We were in the thalamus, so we had gone through the thalamus, which is the major part of the diencephalon, and now we're about to go and do the hypothalamus. We're about to zoom in on the hypothalamus. So let's go ahead and do that. We're zooming in on the hypothalamus here. The hypothalamus is going to have a lot of homeostatic jobs. Okay? A lot of homeostatic jobs. And plus it's going to do a lot of other things. It helps regulate body temperature, blood pressure, water levels. It's going to be involved in controlling shivering, controlling the activities of your gastrointestinal tract, your satiety, like how full you feel. It's going to be involved in hunger, in your biological clock, again, in your water balance. It plays a role in your sex drive, thirst drive, hunger drive. If there's a drive, it probably involves the hypothalamus. It controls a lot of your autonomic nervous system as well. So it does a lot of these important things. It is just beneath the thalamus, and then just beneath it, we see this structure right here. That structure right there is called the infundibulum. Infundibulum. And then attached to the infundibulum is the pituitary gland. We see there's two halves to the pituitary gland. It's a front half, anterior pituitary, and a back half. We know the pituitary gland sits in one of our favorite bones, the sphenoid bone, particularly in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. All right. By the way, when you get to A&P2, they're going to ask you about the infundibulum. So you got to remember that word for A&P2 to impress your A&P2 teacher. All right. So let's talk about this pituitary gland. The front part of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, is going to make and secrete a variety of hormones. I've just listed a couple here. Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. Meanwhile, the posterior pituitary is going to receive hormones made in the hypothalamus. And the hormones it receives that are made in the hypothalamus are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And the posterior pituitary is going to store them and it is going to secrete them. All right, let's talk about these hormones just a bit. Follicle-stimulating hormone is responsible for the development of structures in the ovary called follicles. Follicle-stimulating hormone. Makes sense. Without follicle-stimulating hormone, follicles don't develop. Now, once during every menstrual cycle, usually on day 14, a mature follicle is going to undergo ovulation. And that is the job of luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone causes the ovary to ovulate, to release its egg cell, which, like I said, usually happens on day 14 of the cycle. Okay. Obviously, that's no ovarian role for these two hormones. There's a testicular role as well. Those two hormones are going to help prompt testosterone production and prompt spermatogenesis, making sperm cells. And those two things are going to happen in the testes. So there is a role for the testes and for the ovaries with these two hormones. Prolactin is a hormone that is going to prompt the mammary glands to produce milk. All right. Now that does it for the hormones from the anterior pituitary. I know you're wondering, what about the posterior pituitary? Well, recall that the posterior pituitary is going to get two hormones from the hypothalamus. Those hormones are actually going to travel down through the infundibulum. And the posterior pituitary is going to store them and release them when appropriate. One of those hormones is abbreviated ADH here, and it is known as anti-diuretic hormone. A diuretic is something that makes you pee. It's like water, caffeinated drinks, alcoholic drinks, all diuretics. Antidiuretic hormone makes you not pee. It increases your retention of water in your kidneys, which gets your blood volume and blood pressure up. ADH also squeezes blood vessels, which also gets your blood pressure to go up. So ADH is one of our posterior pituitary hormones. The other one, let's clear this first, then I can advance the slide, is oxytocin. We talked about oxytocin a while ago with its role in the birthing process. All right, folks, with that, we are done with the hypothalamus for the time being, and we can talk about the epithalamus. There is one primary epithalamic structure we have to know, and it's the pineal gland. Somebody thought it looked like a pine nut, so they called it the pineal gland. The major job of the pineal gland is to secrete the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is responsible for maintaining your sleep-wake cycle. I am always messing with my melatonin production because I am looking at screens way too often in the hours and minutes close to when I go to sleep. Darkness prompts the production of melatonin. Melatonin is good for good sleep. So if you want good sleep, get that bedroom nice and dark. Don't be like me and looking on Twitter and Instagram and all that garbage right before you go to sleep. Why do I do that? I don't know. Some animals have a pineal gland that is actually exposed to sunlight because it regulates their behavior as the seasons change as well. Okay, with that, we are done the diencephalon. Yay! And now we get to do the brainstem. Brainstem itself has three regions. They're going to be the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Midbrain is right beneath the diencephalon. Beneath it is the pons. Look at that bulge of the pons, by the way. You can always find the pons because it's got that anterior bulge. Then we got the medulla oblongata right there. All of them anterior to the cerebellum. Okay, starting with the midbrain. The midbrain is going to be just beneath the diencephalon. Like we said, the midbrain is just beneath the diencephalon. And the midbrain has a lot of things going on. The midbrain has a passageway running through it. And we see that passageway right here. Let's put an arrow on it, actually. Always good to put an arrow on things right there. That passageway right there is the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct. What it is going to do, it is going to connect the third ventricle, which we know is in the diencephalon. So third ventricle is going to be up here. And the cerebral aqueduct connects that third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle, which we see right here. Now, in front of the cerebral aqueduct, we are going to find what basically look like a pair of bulges on the anterior midbrain. And those bulges that we see are known as the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles. Now, in the peduncles, we find those axons of the pyramidal neurons we mentioned before, the ones that originate in your precentral gyrus and are sending motor commands down towards the spinal cord. Okay, in the back, let's get rid of that arrow. In the back, you can see this double bulge here. This whole region back here is called the tectum. The word tectum means roof. And again, if we weren't bipeds, the position of the spinal cord and the brain would make this area more like a roof. But on the back of the tectum, I see two bulges here. Now, this is only half the brain, right? So there are really four bulges. The four bulges are called the corpora quadrigemina. The four twin bodies is how that translates. And if we look, There we go. If we look, we can see all 4 bulges right here, as well as that peduncle right there. And the top 2 bulges are called the superior colliculi. The bottom 2 bulges are called the inferior colliculi. The word colliculus basically means like a little hill. And the superior colliculi are visual reflex centers. They're going to help you, move your head and your eyes to track in coordination to track an object. The inferior colliculi are involved in the startle reflex. Well, let's expand upon both of them a little bit. The superior colliculus is very much involved, like we just said, in visual reflexes. So like if you are, let's say there's a bird flying, and you're watching that bird and your eyes and head are moving and you're fixating on that bird, your superior colliculi helps your eyes and your head move in unison as you follow, as you smoothly pursue it with your eyes. If you are catching a fly ball like he's doing, you're using your superior colliculi. The inferior colliculi are involved in a startle reflex. So this gentleman was walking at one point and this bird starts to sing incredibly loudly a melodious song, and it gets the guy to turn his head towards the sound. That's your startle reflex. And turning your body, your head, towards a particular sound is coordinated by your inferior colliculus. You should totally check and see whether, find somebody you know and check and see whether their inferior colliculi are working by hiding and waiting for them to come around a corner or in a room or something. Then you jump out and say, "Ah!" You scream. Just like that. And you get them to jump. Now, they can't get mad at you because you're going to tell them you're just checking their inferior colliculi. And they'll say, "What are the inferior colliculi?" And then you'll go through an entire explanation of the whole midbrain. All right. Awesome. Wow. Let's keep going. Next up is the pons. The word pons literally means bridge. All right. So, yeah, if you know French and Spanish, you can probably recognize that. The pons contains a lot of white matter because it has a lot of tracts, in other words. Tracts are white matter in the spinal cord and brain. And things are going down from higher brain centers to the spinal cord into the cerebellum from the brain stem. And so there's a lot of white matter. There are nuclei. There are nuclei involved in breathing. There are nuclei involved in micturition. The kid in the bottom right-hand picture looks like he has got to micturate. Yeah, micturition is our fanciest word for peeing. So there are micturition centers, there are respiratory centers. There are other nuclei as well in the pons. Okay. Where was I? There we go. All right, down to the medulla. Medulla's right here. Inferior to the pons, superior to the cord. It's got the pyramids in it. Pyramids are the collections of axons from the pyramidal neurons that were in the precentral gyrus that are responsible for initiating movements. Now, the pyramids, of course, do their decussation in the medulla oblongata. And we'll take a look at a picture of that in a moment. The decussation, of course, is what allows for contralateral control. The fact that we are going to have the right side of our brain control the left side of our body. All right. There are also centers for cardiovascular control to affect your heart rate and the force of your heartbeat. There are blood pressure controlling centers. There are respiratory centers. There are sneezing centers. There's a normal looking sneeze right there. This picture illustrates why you should cover up your sneeze. Everybody's sneeze looks like that. Cover it up. All right, where was I? That's pretty much it for our medulla. And with that, let's look at one more picture of the medulla. There it is. You can see the pyramids are here and here. Here are the pyramids. All that's the pyramids right there. And you can see the crossing over points, right? Like the cross hatching right there. That's where the decussation is happening. Okay, cerebellum time. Cerebellum. Going to be involved in complex movements like coordinating them. It also plays a role in attention and language. It sits posterior to the brainstem, inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. If we look at the cerebellum, there are two cerebellar hemispheres, and then there is a vermis in between. The word vermis means worm, maybe you can see. And there are actually a trio of body maps in the cerebellum. We know the cerebellum is responsible for coordinating movement. I mean, think about a complex movement like pitching a baseball. Your cerebellum has the job of comparing what the muscles are supposed to be doing with what they're actually doing and then making corrections. So your cerebrum tells your muscles what to do. The cerebrum tells the cerebellum the plan. Then the cerebellum gets feedback from the muscles. So the cerebellum can compare what's happening with what's supposed to be happening. And the cerebellum can fix it. All right. Where was I? Cerebellum? I think we're done with the cerebellum. Holy moly. Actually, let me go back and point out one thing. In the cerebellum, we have white matter. The white matter in the cerebellum is referred to as the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae. There we go. It's actually the name of a tree. There's this kind of fir tree that people thought had medicinal properties, so they called it the tree of life. And then someone was like, oh, the cerebellum white matter looks like that fir tree. What was that thing called? Arbor vitae. Yeah, let's call it that. It's literally how it happened. All right, folks. Good news is we are now ready to do just a few more things. Whoops. There we go. Couple more things. The reticular formation and reticular activating system. Okay, so the reticular formation is this kind of like collection of gray matter that we're going to find throughout our brainstem. Okay? Gets into the cord, into the diencephalon a little bit as well. It is going to do a lot of regulation of like just resting activities. Like you always have a certain amount of muscle tone, right? Even if you're not like actively flexing a muscle, there's still a tone to it. Okay? The reticular formation helps in regulating your blood pressure, your heart rate, by communicating with the centers for that in the medulla and the pons. Now, there's a sensory component of the reticular formation called the reticular activating system. This is what keeps us alert, rouses us from sleep. It is very important when you're actually in class that your reticular activating system is working properly. So you are aroused, you are alert, and not drifting off into sleepland. Okay. Sweet. Limbic system. The limbic system. The limbic system is composed of a bunch of stuff in both our cerebrum and our diencephalon. We got things like the cingulate gyrus, which is part of our cerebrum. Part of the another part of the cerebrum called the parahippocampus. Part of the cerebrum called the hippocampus. The amygdala that we mentioned before. The mammillary body, which we mentioned in the lab. The fornix, which is white matter that we learned about in the lab as well. So these are all parts of the limbic system. The limbic system is going to play large roles in both emotion and in memory. Okay? The hippocampus plays a role in storing storing memories long term. The amygdala is very much involved in fear. The mammillary bodies are involved in episodic memory. Like imagine you're replaying a show in your head. And this collection of structures is called the limbic system. All right. Where was I? I totally lost my train of thought there. One of my kids yelled something. I don't know if you were able to hear it or not. But they made me laugh and it made me lose my train of thought. All right. Pathways to the brain. So we got to, lastly, guys, talk about how information gets between our brain and our cord. If we look at a slice of the spinal cord, we see in red the descending bits of white matter, the descending tracks, that are taking information from our brain down to our cord. Now later on, when you take a real anatomy course, you will have to name these guys. I don't want you to remember all these names right now, but you can probably figure things out. I mean, the tectospinal tract goes from the tectum to the spinal cord. Corticospinal tract, cortex to spinal cord. Then meanwhile, the blue guys are ascending things, so they're going up. And of course, remember, things that are ascending are going to be sensory, things that are descending are going to be motor. And again, we're not going to learn these names at the moment, but we can kind of figure them out. Spinocerebellar from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Spinothalamic from the spinal cord to the thalamus. So we can see these sensory and motor pathways. If we look at sensory pathways, we're basically going from some receptor, maybe a proprioreceptor, maybe a touch receptor, up to our brain. And depending on if it's a touch receptor or a proprioceptor, that would be somatosensory. If it was a sensor, say, sensing the stretch of your stomach, that would be viscerosensory. So viscerosensory would give us information about our viscera, about our internal organs. And usually it's a 2 to 3 neuron path to get from the receptor to the brain. Of course, usually it's paired. I mean, left side going up, right side going up. And normally there is decussation, the switching of sides that gives us the contralateral sensory control. So that's our basic idea about sensory pathways. See a picture of it here. So you got a proprioceptor in a muscle, sensory neuron going to the spinal cord. Look at that unipolar neuron right there. Look at that dorsal root ganglion. There we go. And that guy, he's synapsing in the spinal cord, but also going up to synapse up in the brainstem, switching sides in the brainstem, going up to the thalamus, one more synapse, and then we get up to the postcentral gyrus where we have our primary somatosensory cortex. So that would be a classic sensory pathway, a classic ascending pathway. Now motor pathways, going from the brain to the effector. Usually the effector is a skeletal muscle. This is going to be typically a 2 neuron path. Occasionally it'll be more. And again, these are usually paired. So we're bilaterally symmetrical. We got muscles on the left, we got muscles on the right. And as we've said many times before, there is usually decussation happening in the medulla oblongata, which is where we switch sides, and we get the contralateral control. All right, so if you look at a picture here, we're starting up in the precentral gyrus, which we know is our primary motor cortex. Again, we can see that distribution according to body parts. Pyramidal neurons send their axons down, 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 through the brainstem, through into the medulla oblongata, switching sides, the decussation of the pyramids, then down, 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 ending up in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, where we synapse with the motor neuron outward to a skeletal muscle. So, guys, with that, we are officially done the brain lecture. This is number 3, the shortest of the 3. And we're done with the brain. Next time we meet, we will be doing the spinal cord. All right, I'll see you later.